Greetings all, FerrariMan601 here. Welcome back to another 1/18th scale model car review of this, the 2005 McLaren MP420. Now, to me, this car is the holy of holies. This is my favorite Formula One car of all time. And I know that this is quite the travesty to admit, considering that I call myself Ferrari Man. However, I don't think there's too much to be contested as to the claim of this being one of the greatest single-seat race cars of all time. Let's talk a little bit about why this is. Now, of course, I am keenly aware that there are several other Formula One cars and race cars in general that have far more claims to fame than the MP420. I am an astute student of motorsport history, and I assure you I know all about the Ferrari F2002 and F2004 and the 2000 car and 2001 car. Basically, anything that was running for Ferrari in this era was going to be more successful, at least on paper, than the McLaren MP420. Looking at the 2005 season, we also remember that McLaren quite famously failed to win the Constructors' or Drivers' Championship relative to Fernando Alonso and Renault. But, to me, and this is entirely subjective on my part, the most impressive and most wildly spectacular car of the 2005 season was this, the McLaren MP420. And, wouldn't you know, the first Grand Prix that I ever watched in terms of making a point to get up early in the morning and watch it was the 2005 Monaco Grand Prix, and of course it was won by Kimi Räikkönen driving one of these. In the 13 or so years that have elapsed since that day in May 2005, I have searched high and low for a model of the MP420, and it has taken me this long to locate one, and lo and behold, fortune has so decided that I have come into the acquisition of two of them. Yes. Here we can see that they are both driven by Juan Pablo Montoya. However, one of them is a little bit rare inasmuch that it is dressed up in its tobacco livery, the West sponsorship there that the McLarens were running at select races at the time. There you go, get a good look at that. One of very few models that I've ever found in a full-on tobacco livery. It was an aftermarket conversion, I'm led to believe. I don't know the whole history on that one, but I now have it, and we're all going to take a look at it. In terms of what the McLaren MP420 is and what it did on the racetrack. Well, of course, it is the car fielded in 2005 by McLaren International. It was designed by none other than Adrian Newey. The car's immediate predecessor was the MP419 and MP419B of 2004, and its immediate successor was the MP421 of 2006. The MP420, therefore, due to the regulation changes, it's the last McLaren ever to compete with a V10 engine, and of course the 2005 tire rules as well, meaning that tires could not be changed during the duration of the Grand Prix, nor could they be changed after qualifying. Well, we've got the very infamous Michelin tires on both of these MP420s as the cars would have been running in 2005. In terms of what the car physically is, well, it's pretty conventional compared to what else you would have been seeing on the grid in that era. We have got a molded carbon fiber and aluminum honeycomb monocoque, so that survival cell, including the cockpit, that basically safety zone for the driver to be shielded by. It's all in there, and it's all carbon and aluminum composites as you would have expected. The suspension on the front and rear, it is a double wishbone push rod arrangement, as we can start to see here as this one's coming around there. There you go, the upper and lower wishbones, and then the push rod coming up into the chassis. Also, that is actuating an inboard torsion bar via the push rods and bell cranks there, and of course we've got a double wishbone arrangement as well. So dampers mounted high in the chassis, actuated by those push rods via bell cranks, and the rear suspension is exactly the same. Double wishbone push rod with a torsion bar and bell cranks and spring dampers as well. The engine in this, we mentioned that this is one of the final cars of the V10 era. It is the Mercedes Ilmor FO110R. It's a 3-liter V10, naturally aspirated, of course, producing somewhere in the neighborhood of 950 to 1,000 horsepower, revving to an absolutely crazy 19,300 RPM. Yes, absolutely insane engines in this era. Again, 2005, the last year for the full field of V10s. The actual last V10 Formula One engine raced in 2006, courtesy of Toro Rosso. But it was the last hurrah for everybody else with the V10. The transmission in this car was a McLaren-designed 7-speed paddle-actuated semi-automatic paddle shift unit, plus reverse as well, so 7 forward gears and 1 reverse. Fuel, as you could surmise there, supplied by Mobil 1. The tires are Michelin, as we have mentioned. Of course, competition history, well, the car did not win either the Constructors' or Drivers' Championship, but it was driven in all 19 races in 2005 by Kimi Räikkönen and Juan Pablo Montoya, principally. However, 2 other drivers did get a go in the MP420 in race conditions. They were Pedro de la Rosa and Alexander Wurz. Juan Pablo Montoya, he had very famously injured himself in what was officially called a tennis accident at the start of 2005. Therefore, De La Rosa was called up to deputize for the Colombian in Bahrain, and then Alexander Wurz actually drove Montoya's car at Imola in 2005. That very famous race involving Fernando Alonso and Michael Schumacher fighting for the win in the closing laps, also interrupted for many people around the world by ITV's very unfortunately timed commercial break. But Kimi Räikkönen drove the car for all 19 rounds. Montoya, when he returned from his injury, he also drove the second car for the remainder of the season. De La Rosa and Wurz only having a couple of starts, and I believe Wurz only had that start at Imola in 2005. The car made its debut at the 2005 Australian Grand Prix, which of course was the season opener. In the course of 19 races, the MP420 took victory in 10 of them, took 18 total podium finishes, took 7 pole positions, and scored 12 fastest laps. That is a mightily impressive scorecard when you're talking about overall stats of a race car. Winning 10 out of 19 races, that's over half the season, with 18 total podium finishes. You would expect this car to have been a championship winner, but when it was not winning or finishing on the podium, it was in pieces, on fire, throwing up a lot of smoke, parked on the side of the road, or stuffed into a tire barrier without its right front wheel if you're Kimi Räikkönen at the Nürburgring. McLaren had absolutely dismal reliability. It seemed like when Räikkönen did well, Montoya retired, and when Montoya did well, Räikkönen retired. McLaren simply could not get the juggernaut going that a team really needs when they're fighting for the Constructors' Championship. The MP420, like its MP418 predecessor, the test car from 2003, it was dogged by reliability issues and setup issues and things of that nature that just kept McLaren from fighting consistently with Renault, even though on paper the MP420 was by far the superior car. Renault and Fernando Alonso were able to steal the spoils of victory away from McLaren's grasp in 2005, winning both the Drivers' and Constructors' Championship, a feat that they would go on to repeat in 2006, taking both championships in succession. In terms of what we have here, though, as a model, well, as I mentioned, we have got ourselves quite the rarity. It has truly taken me since that day in 2005 at the Monaco Grand Prix to find myself an example of the MP420 in 1/18th scale. Part of the reason for this is, of course, in 2005, I was still a teenager, and I didn't have money of my own, and I didn't work, and things like that. Plus, the internet was still kind of an inaccessible thing in many regards, so I really didn't have the access to be able to purchase these things when they were being made. So now that I do have the resources, it's a game of catch-up, trying to find models that I really wanted from my first year as a full-time Formula One fan. But here they are. I did not set off with the intention of getting 2 of these. I saw this one here, just in the normal Juan Pablo spec on eBay, and I said, well, it's an MP420 and it looks like it's in good shape and it's been years, so I really want one, so I got that one. Then I saw this one a few weeks later, again Montoya, but it's in the West livery, and these never existed as far as mini champs were concerned in terms of producing these for global markets. So that's an aftermarket conversion. It was so cool, I had to get it, and it can be flanked by this one, which was gotten very deliberately. So there it is, the MP420. Let's take a little bit of a closer look at both of these. Now, in terms of what these are as models, of course, they are mini champs, and mini champs always do an absolutely spectacular job of their Formula One models. Their price points are pretty good. When these were new, they probably would have sold for around 120 to 150 US dollars. Nowadays, the mini champs models have gotten a little bit more expensive due to, well, inflation mostly, but that's what these would have gone for back in 2005, 2006 when they would have been new. Of course, nowadays, both of them were significantly less expensive than that in terms of what I paid for them, simply because, well, they're not really in demand, and the people who have them are most likely not looking to sell them, and they're certainly not looking to sell them for a profit. So I'll now become the custodian of both of these MP420s, and I'll be quite happy about it. In terms of what you get for your money, though, if you're able to find one, well, as you can see here, as the West livery car spins around in front of us, you have your typically good Mini Champs detail work going on all around the car. There are no opening features on the MP420 as we see it here. This is pretty common for Mini Champs models. When they produce models of recent Formula One cars, they really don't have the sorts of access that you would need in order to make removable bodywork and model all the components underneath. So they're all sealed body models, but again, that is in keeping with what Mini Champs typically do have to show us, and it's quite acceptable. It's not going to be on the level of Exodo or CMC or anything like that, but for what they are, Mini Champs definitely are the best in terms of accessibility when it comes to recent year Formula One models. For example, you can already get 2018 cars from Mini Champs, even though we're only right now in May of 2019. So again, if you're looking to get them as soon as possible, this is basically the best you could hope to get in terms of detail and accessibility. Of course, back in these days, it was not much different for the Mini Champs brand, or pretty much any other brand either. In terms of overall details, aside from that, sorry for the beep there, but here we go on the front end of the West car, and you can see, yep, there is the silver version of the front wing that McLaren were running in this year. In the early part of the season, you would have seen a completely black front wing on the MP420 of either driver's car. And again, this was just a small livery update that McLaren brought on as the season unfolded, and it's still quite common to this day to see small livery tweaks going on throughout the course of a Formula One season. Moving rearward on the car, you can see, there we go, with our double wishbone push rod front suspension there. Get some light in there. You can see it a little bit more readily. There we are. There is some carbon look on the suspension arms, and you can see the brake duct detail in there as well. Very nicely done. The suspension pickup points and things all look correct. And of course, there's the push rod going up into the monocoque as well. Across the top of the nose, there is an antenna aerial and a pitot tube array there, just giving the designers, the engineers on the pit wall, some measurements in terms of what the car is doing aerodynamically. So all of that is nice to see. Slightly flexible in terms of the detail work by Mini Champs, so you're not going to break it unless you try. And then over here on the left-hand side of the car, the same front suspension, brake duct, and all of that. Front wing, of course, these flap elements would have been separate elements. Mini Champs not doing that really. It's just one piece of plastic here, but again, many models do that in terms of trying to save costs a little bit and bring the price point down, make it a little bit more accessible. So all that's fine. In terms of the livery here, the decal applications on the nose, there is the silver three-pointed star of Mercedes with the McLaren logo just below. I always like this little red accent that McLaren put on their livery in this era. It looks really cool, makes the front of the car stand out a bit. I like that. And then the other sponsorship graphics going on, Mobil 1, SAP, Siemens, AT&T. AT&T, remember them. I remember that logo. That goes back quite a while. And then, of course, West, Siemens once again. And then there is the emergency kill switch and clutch actuation for the marshals or the driver to be actuating in case the car suddenly loses all power out on track. Into the cockpit, there is the helmet of Juan Pablo Montoya, again in the tobacco livery on this one, but nice detail on there nonetheless. Very cool. Computer Associates, remember that. I remember mentioning this on my review of the MP416 model as well. What happened to that company? Not sure. Don't think they're called Computer Associates anymore. But yep, if you are of this era, you'll remember and recognize all of these logos on the helmet here. Moving your rears on the car a little bit, the cockpit surround, there we go, the Hugo Boss logo with Montoya's name and the Colombian flag. There's the other kill switch for the marshals. And on the sides of the intake snorkel, you can see these two very distinctive features that everybody noticed in 2005 on the McLarens. They're the Viking horns, as we started to call them. What they're really doing is they're just trying to spoil the airflow a little bit in terms of smooth it out as the air comes around the snorkel and toward the rear wing, as you can see, right in line with those two fins. So again, these were little aero flick-ups that the teams were allowed to be placing on the cars in this era. Moving down the side pods there, the inboard side of the side pod, you can see how everything just sort of tucks into itself and starts to flow down toward the rear suspension, which is wrapped in that gold foil there. That's for heat protection because, of course, your suspension elements are going to be carbon, and carbon is not particularly good at high temperatures if you've ever used charcoal. So you want to shield that from the very hot engine exhaust as well as the very hot radiator and gearbox cooling air coming out of the rear zone of the car from that area. The side pod here itself, you can see the radiator inlets through there. There is actually a little bit of an attempt of a detail at a radiator matrix in there. It's a little bit hard to see with the focal length, but yeah, you can see some fins inside there. Nicely done. There's, of course, your wing mirror. And then moving up on the side pod, here's a chimney. Remember these? Little exhaust for the radiator and then a little winglet just behind. Very nice. The little swooping sections of bodywork ahead of the rear tires. Again, just trying to get the air to go around the rear tires, up and over them rather, just to keep them out of the airstream because those big wheels hanging out the back, they do produce quite a bit of drag. As we continue to go, here's the profile view. We can start to get a sense of what the barge board detail is doing here on the front section. Here we go. Yes. Very nice, very complicated. Of course, not as complicated as you'd be apt to see today, simply because, well, design technology and wind tunnel and computational fluid dynamics, all of that has moved on quite a bit since this car was racing, but very nicely done indeed. Absolutely marvelous. Love it to death. And of course, I have to love it to death. This is my favorite Formula One car of all time. Cockpit, there we go. You can see the steering wheel, very similar to the steering wheels that we've already seen on the MP4 18 as well as the MP4 23. But again, they're all siblings and they're all pretty much contemporaries as well. So there is the Mercedes branded McLaren steering wheel, and there's even a little replication of some of the switches on the sides of the cockpit there on the dashboard proper, as well as the gauge cluster there, which those of you who have played Assetto Corsa and you've driven the VRC version of the McLaren MP4 20, you're well familiar with what that gauge cluster shows you. Very pretty. Put the light down for a moment and reach over. You can see that the steering is operable. Moving the front wheels around with my fingers, and you can see that the steering wheel is rotating respectively. So very, very cool. Additionally, moving to the rear, we'll start it rotating again. And here's where we really start to envision just what Adrian Newey had in mind when he was designing the MP420. Have a look at what he's doing with the rear zone. And I remember pointing this out on my MP420 review for Assetto Corsa as well, the VRC mod. But just have a look at what's going on here. Of course, we have the diffuser down low where you'd expect a diffuser to be. And it doesn't look all that different from the Formula One diffusers that we've seen not only in this era, but even today. Big central tunnel, and then two smaller and wider levels of this diffuser as we move laterally. And again, you're just trying to funnel air out of the bottom section of the car, letting it expand as the car moves away. And of course, when air expands in a confined space, its pressure drops, creating a suction effect. So the car is effectively pulled down onto the circuit by the diffuser. But looking at the rear zone as a whole, and this is where Adrian Newey's design genius really starts to come to the fore. Of course, here we have got the rain light, highly reflective as you can see, but there's no red filter or anything there. It's just a silver rain light. And then we have the rear wing, the beam wing down here with the Michelin decals on it. And then we have our end fences and the main plane of the rear wing. However, look at what's going on here. We have, of course, the rear wing main plane, but if you go below that and slightly forward, if we go above, you can get a better angle on this. You can see the McLaren are also running a T-wing. It's not quite the T-wings that we saw in 2017, but it is a T-wing nonetheless, and you can see it running here just forward of the rear wing and a bit below. Come off to the side and you'll be able to see this a little bit more nicely. There is that T-wing running across there, just hooked up to the rear of the engine cover by that bridge section. But there it is. Very cool. But there's more. What if I told you, all the way back in 2005, that Adrian Newey was experimenting with the Coanda effect? You remember that from 2012, 2013 with the V8 engines and those ramps coming off the back of the side pods? Well, the MP420 also has Coanda ramps in the same vein as what we saw in 2012, 2013. Have a look at the exhaust outlets here, and you'll notice that they're kind of nestled in pretty deep, and they're also seemingly obstructed by this rather large gearbox casing. You can see it sort of comes up in this bulbous protrusion out the rear zone of the car before it finally terminates in the rear crash structure. The reason why that's there is so that the flow coming out of these exhausts will entrain itself and attach itself to that gearbox casing, and in so doing, it will be accelerated down the side of the car, and then it'll blow two things. It'll blow the upper suspension wishbones there, the inboard faces of which are covered with that gold heat treatment, and it will also blow the beam wing out the back. So again, 2005 compared to 2012. Same design philosophy going on. Completely different engines, a little bit different in terms of configuration, in terms of where the exhausts are and all of that, but the McLaren MP420 was taking advantage of the exhaust-blown Coanda effect all the way back in 2005, well before that became a Formula One design talking point. That is really cool, and I suppose it should be no coincidence that the other cars which really took advantage of that effect were also Adrian Newey designs, the Red Bull RB8 and RB9 specifically. Very, very cool, all of that. So we get them rotating again. We take a look at the other MP420. Again, it's exactly the same configuration. The only difference is the livery there. But again, you can see the same sorts of details going on the rear zone of this one. It is basically an identical copy of the one that we just saw, but there it is. Those are the exhausts. There is the rather high gearbox casing, and then coming out the back, you can see how they are blowing the rear suspension and the beam wing, like so. Very, very cool. Love that little design quirk, which I quite honestly never noticed in the day. Being a new Formula One fan in 2005, I initially didn't even know what sorts of engines that these cars had. When I heard them running around at Monaco, I had never heard a piston engine sound anything like that. Of course, those of you who love the sound of the V10, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But I had never heard a piston engine rev that high. So, me being 13 years old or so, I had no clue what it was that I was actually hearing. Initially thought that perhaps these cars were gas turbines of some sort, because I just didn't know that a piston engine could do that. But, of course, learning more about the sport, I came to understand what it actually was that I was hearing, and it became even cooler because I was then visualizing 10 pistons flying up and down in there like 400 times a second, and it was just fantastic, and it still is fantastic, and I'm still very much one of those V10 forever, bring back the V10, bring back the V12 sorts of guys. I know it'll never happen because nobody likes anything nice anymore, but we can still dream, and of course we can still appreciate the absolutely fantastic cars that we had in these days, the MP420 notwithstanding. Really, again, I know that it was a little bit of a different story with my review of the Ferrari 641, that being an Exato model and very highly detailed and very rare, but to me these are just as significant in terms of being able to have them as models, simply because they are what they are, and they have the sorts of value to me as my personal journey of being a fan of motorsport took off in 2005 with the Monaco Grand Prix, which was won by this car. Of course, it was driven by Kimi Räikkönen in that Grand Prix. It was won by Kimi in that Grand Prix, but still, they're not Raikkonen models, but they're Montoya. Who doesn't love Juan Pablo Montoya? And, of course, to be able to have two of them, it's definitely something that is very, very, very cool. And here, just want to take you the opportunity to show you the underside of one of them. I know that some of you ask to see the underside sometimes, so here it is. Just as you would expect in this era, there is the replication of the wood composite plank. That's the legality plank, so the FIA can act as the fun police if you're bottoming out too much. And then the outboard sides of the floor reasonably flat as you'd expect until you get to the diffuser side back here. But very cool and very much in line with what you'd expect to see on Formula One cars of this particular vintage. On the bottom, for those interested, there is the confirmation that it is 1/18 scale, made in China, of course. These are the Mini Champs models, but they're manufactured in China. Here it is, McLaren Mercedes MP420 2005. Note the spelling or the rendering of MP420 there. I prefer to write the name of this car with a / between the 4 and 20. Officially, it was written this way with just the simple dash between the 4 and the 20, but I like it better with the / and other McLaren cars before 2005, really going back to, I believe, 2002 or 2003 was the last time that they officially used the / before they went over to the simple dash. Not quite sure why they changed that, but they did change that. I maintain the / because it fits with the McLaren Project 4 collaboration that continued all the way up until, when was this? 2016. Yes, because the 2017 car was called the MCL32. So the MP430 and MP431 were the last MP4 branded McLaren Formula One cars. But there it is, the MP420 for the record at the top there. Paul's Model Art Mini Champs company, known by two names. They're the same company. Very, very cool to see all of this. But I know some of you like to see the undersides of the models. There it is on the MP420. As far as what's left to talk about on the MP420, not all that much. You have seen pretty much everything that there is to see on both of these cars. Just, again, very fortunate that I'm able to have these because, again, it is my favorite all-time F1 car, and I have wanted a model of the MP420 for as long as I've been a Formula One fan. So now, finally, I've got the opportunity to have two of these, and I am very, 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 very happy that all of that has occurred, and now that you have seen them all as well, they can take a very nice place in the collection, and certainly they're going to be ones that are displayed frequently. So again, very, very cool to have these. It's been a long time coming, but there they are. The McLaren MP420 from 2005. 1/18 scale by Mini Champs. Until next time, I would like to thank you all very, very much for watching. Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you very much, and of course, we will see you soon.